Well, welcome back everyone from that very brief break. We want to get started right away. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Lorna Gold, the Director of Movement Building at Faith Invest, who will be introducing and sharing the panel on ecological economics. Welcome, Lorna.
Thanks, Becky. It's a great joy to be here with you all today at this wonderful event. I certainly enjoyed the opening session there. Our panel discussion now is going to focus on the idea of ecological economics. I think we're all aware that in the post-COVID world, and especially from the contributions that we've just listened to, the need for new models of economics. There's an increasing urgency to redirect investments into solutions, climate solutions, nature-based solutions, solutions that support gender justice. And we also need to curtail investments in those kinds of economic and financial investments that are hurting our planet Earth, hurting the womb of the Earth. And the divestment movement's been part of this, the shareholder engagement movement, which the faiths have really been part of. But what more can be done? I think there's a great awareness in the faith communities now of the need of the disconnect that exists between the logic of money and our faith values, and the need to do two things: to practice what we preach and also to put our money where our mouths are. We have two great panelists to join us now to talk about these issues from different perspectives. I'm not going to be giving great introductions because you have them in your brochures, but let's first, I'll introduce the two panelists and then I'll invite the first one to give their talk. Our first speaker will be Professor Michael Northcott, who is Professor of Religion and Ecology at the Indonesian Consortium of Religious Studies. And he's going to talk to us today about the Luciferian magic of money and the spiritual ecology of love. After Michael, we will hear from Father Tobias Karcher, SJ, from La Salle House in Switzerland. And he will talk to us about faith and finance, the challenge of faith-consistent investing. So you're both very, very welcome. And I'll now ask Professor Michael Northcott to give your talk.
Yeah, I'd love to, but my video is blocked. Now it's open. I'll see if I can share my screen now. Yeah. And you'll see the screen?
We can see it fine.
Very good. So on the right is the front cover of a book by a very interesting German economist called Hans Christoph Binswanger, which in German, the title is more interesting than in English. It's simply Geld und Magie, i.e. gold, but really money and magic. My interest, the title of my talk reflects my own theological belief that money creation is the dark secret behind the ecological crisis and the climate crisis that we're all in the midst of. But this belief is counter to what most economists argue, which is that that money doesn't have an independent power of its own. So they believe that money only oils the wheels of commerce. So the laws of supply and demand are said not to be influenced by money creation. I think this view is highly misleading. Indeed, I think it's deeply wrong. In truth, I think that money is a fetish which reifies the personal and spiritual energies in human interactions with creation, nature, and other persons, and that the monopolization or capture of money by central and commercial banks is the alchemy that Goethe allegorized in Faust, as Christoph Binswanger shows in his book. But of course, it's this alchemy which underwrites the unequal global exchanges, such as the theft of Borneo's rainforests, and the translation of that theft into property empires, just to take one example from the region in which I now live. Most of the money that came from the sale of large areas of North Borneo, the state of Sarawak, went to the property empire of one man, the former governor of the state called Mohammed Taib. The decentralization of money power and its continued localization, for example, in small savings banks like the Sparkasse in Germany, is, I would argue, very, very urgent priority going forward if we are to detach money and money creation from the ongoing destruction of the planet. However, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, both oppose the creation of small banks, and European banking regulation is increasingly threatening the German decentralized model of banking. In the UK, we haven't got a decentralized model, and efforts by people like Professor Richard Lorna to start a community bank are opposed by the Bank of England. Oh yeah, there we go. Of course, as theologians, or some of us here are theologians, we well know that the worship of money is a problem because it's said to have distracted the Israelites when Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments as a great event of revelation of divine will in the book of Exodus, the worshipping of the golden calf. And what's rather intriguing about that story is the golden calf and the Ten Commandments were wrought by the two brothers, Moses and Aaron. It's as if they represent the two ways, that of the creator redeemer and that of the artificer, the idolater, Lucifer in my title, which Moses symbolized when he melted the golden calf into a serpent, the image of the devil, right, which he held aloft and then said, choose life. So Binswanger argues that in Goethe's Faust, the counter-spirit Mephistopheles gives to Faust the power of alchemy, symbolized by the chemical wedding of the elements of mercury and sulfur, which represent the interest capital. But it represents paper money, and sulfur, which represents interest or capital. The alchemy of paper money is scattered everywhere like wildfire blazing as currency, and none its course may stop. Paper money gives, according to Faust, to the state power over the forces of nature, to appropriate nature as property and to create value out of nothing. The creation of value through money creation is magical because it's not attributable to human effort on nature. And this magic combines with the transformation of mineral resources, gold and silver, and of course then oil, into paper money, which the power of the state legitimizes. The first bank to succeed in this Faustian endeavor was, of course, the Bank of England in 1694, which was set up after the defeat of the English army in an event that's sometimes called the Glorious Revolution, rather ironically, when Prince William from the Netherlands took over England. Strangely, the Bank of England's temple is actually filled with images of serpents, which is very, very curious. And so some people do think that there's almost a symbolic representation of the idea that money creation is a form of dark magic. Binswanger says that starting out from the 19th century, England legally authorized paper money, supplemented by the book money of private commercial banks, and began a march of triumphs that would soon conquer the world. It became the basis for English world power and her domination of trade. Well, this is just a little side slide, but it's rather curious that every year the Bank of England wheels out Gog and Magog, who are, of course, representatives of the devil in the Old and New Testaments, as the mascots of the City of London. It's almost as if they want to confirm my spiritual interpretation. Of course, conventionally, the Reformation is said to have eradicated magic and the corruption of simony, in which Christian rituals were performed for money. But actually, the Reformation led to the monopolization of magic, and particularly the magic of money, by the state Leviathan, and its issuing of paper money through the first central banks of England, and then, of course, this one here, which is the Bank of Scotland, very close to where I used to work in Edinburgh. Now, in Laudato Si, Pope Francis contrasts the magical monetization of human and human earth relations with the divine ecology of love, which upholds cosmic and creaturely being. He also makes a theological contrast between the false magic of monetary value, creation out of nothing by interest-bearing debt and paper money, and the privatization of public and natural assets like water, and even now with carbon credits, the atmosphere, the true magic of divine creation of the cosmos and biodiversity, which the Pope argues was a magic of love, love for humanity and for creatures, and in order to express the eternal values of goodness, beauty, and truth. As the Pope put it, once more, we need to reject a magical conception of the market, which would suggest that problems can be solved simply by an increase in profits of companies or individuals. And he goes on in another section, a sober look at our world shows the degree of human intervention in the service of business interests and consumers is making our earth less rich and beautiful. So in essence, the Pope argues that the combination of scientism, atheism, and monetarism are subverting the traditional Christian belief in a divine creation and the traditional Christian idea of a correlation between divine ideas and the forms, beauty, goodness, truth, and so on, that we encounter in creation. And that this is being driven forward by monetization, commerce, consumerism, and technology. Now, in his account of integral ecology, the Pope refers to the idea of land as divine gift rather than commodity. He refers to the need to restrain greenhouse gas emissions to protect the climate, and he argues that all non-human uses need to be caught up in a redemptive divine ecology of love. And among some of the more practical points he makes, he refers to the needs of people in cities for green spaces, for unpolluted air, for beautiful public buildings and squares, and to drink unpolluted water that isn't sold to them by private corporation. So the vision of integral ecology in Laudato Si includes much which is only mainstream and just enough in radical environmentalism, including even biomimicry. But the question arises, how might such a neo-romantic ecology of love resist and revise the growing inequality between peoples and the growing asymmetry between humans and the earth, which are, I would argue, the dark side of exponential money creation. Now, since I wrote this slide, it's come to my attention that in the last 12 months, in the name of the COVID-19 crisis, the United States created somewhere between 30 and 40% of all the dollars ever printed. Similar things are happening in London and in Frankfurt. And it was said that this was done in order to save the world from the recession created by these huge business destroying lockdowns. And yet, in fact, these quantities of money were needed to save the city from yet another derivatives-based disaster at the end of 2019, as a report from the International Bank of Settlements recently confirmed. The real issue is that money creation is now going faster than ever at the present time. And what has this got to do with caring for the earth? Well, the point is, this is a secret cult of money creation, and it benefits a very small number of people. That money was not given to ordinary people. It was given to a very small elite. And what did the elite do with that money? They invest in fossil fuels. They invest in destruction of forests. They invest in ways that turn nature into value and ultimately ends up in their bank accounts. So in essence, Binswanger's argument that 19th century money creation, which fueled the birth of global capitalism, also saw the end of patrimony, which is the idea that the production of the earth needs to be restrained by concern for future generations. And he argues that in its place, there emerged in the 19th century the old Roman imperial idea of property as purely as dominion over the earth and dominion over other people. Consequently, representations of creative values in production do not account for destruction of natural values. Now, of course, there are many economists who are trying to put this right, and one of them is arguably Dieter Helm, who's a very influential British economist, an ecological economist. But the way that he proposes for doing this is to turn nature itself into natural capital. I happen to believe that this is completely wrong-headed, and it doesn't address the underlying issue at all, which is the fact that when so much money is constantly created, it goes out and looks for things to do, and it looks for the highest return on investment, which still remain at the moment, things like oil and gas and mining and deforestation. Laudato Si makes a much more radical case for ecological ethics and ecological economics. When it opposes the privatization of common resources, it's morally wrong. It proposes that creatures are intrinsically valuable, since all creatures are part of the redemptive purpose of God. That species and ecosystems are reflections of divine goodness. That the recognition of the intrinsic worth of created value is relativized as human created values, including money creation. And it commends a reconnection of production processes with nature in the circular economy and a person's innate through an ecology of love for creatures. Where there are conflicts in resource access, it argues they should be moderated by recognition of the needs of the poor and the universal destination of goods. Well, I'm pretty much out of time, so I'll just conclude with that previous slide. But to underline the point that the idea of a circular economy is completely wrecked by money creation, because when you have that quantity of money from central banks pouring into the City of London, Wall Street, and the city in Frankfurt, but of course it all goes on in China, it goes on in Tokyo and many other countries, that money goes out and looks for things to do. And until central banks and money creation are dethroned in their power to wreck human lives through economic crisis and to wreck the environment, I am skeptical of the capacity of what some call economics, ecological economics, significantly to change the current direction of travel. I mean, of course, some argue that this will all be resolved by a move to blockchain-based currencies, which some also argue is what's going to happen in the Great Reset. But that's kind of another lecture. Though I would say that some attempt, whether it's through blockchain or some other means, to get to recreate the kind of controls on money creation that we used to have under the gold standard, and which of course Richard Nixon abolished in 1971, is urgent if we are to address the planetary ecological crisis. And ultimately, though, it seems to me calling for that is about not only economics and ethics, but the spiritual recognition that there is something deeply dark in the current domination of private magic money creation of what goes on in the city and what the city invests in. And that hope for the earth and hope for humans rests first in recognizing that spiritual darkness and exposing it to the truth of the gospel, and in calling for its radical reform and change. Well, thank you very much. I'm out of time. Very grateful to be invited to this very interesting conference and opening set of events for the Laudato Si Institute, and look forward very much to what my fellow panelists have to say.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for bringing us on that tour de force of the creation of money, its connections to our deepest psyche, our deepest how the current crisis is so connected to this misuse or the misunderstanding of where money comes from, where it's created from. I was really taken by your call for the democratization of money, the decentralization, and how the current major kind of injection of money, that's such a shocking statistic about the amount of dollars created in the past year through COVID, and how centralized this creation of money is, and this idea of dethroning the current system, and the need to, like Laudato Si, as pointers, radical pointers of the direction that we need to be going in. I'm sure people have questions already, and I would invite you to put your questions into the Q&A box. And we'll come now to Father Tobias, who is, I know by reputation through my work with Faith Invest. He was very involved in the setting up of the Faith Invest organisation, and works at La Salle House in Switzerland, and is going to talk to us today about faith and finance and the role that faiths can play in this reset of, I guess, the investment industry and the creation and the use of money. Over to you, Father Tobias.
Thank you very much, Lorna, for your kind introduction. Let me open my presentation. All right. Thanks again for inviting me, and I hope to be able to contribute to this important discussion on Laudato Si, and especially on the implementation of its important topics. Let's see, now it doesn't transport. Let's see what happens here. Let me go back. I have to, whoop, this. Sorry, now it should be all right. Yes. All right, so I will start with this quote of Pope Francis: "The majority of the people living on our planet professes to be believers. They should spur religions to dialogue among themselves for the sake of protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity." And this invitation of Pope Francis has received a very concrete target with those Sustainable Development Goals by the UN. And now the question is, which role can the faith play in achieving these goals? Just to give you my background against which I'm giving this presentation. So I'm directing the Center for Spirituality, Dialogue and Responsibility. So we focus on interreligious dialogue. We accompany Swiss and international philanthropies on their spiritual and ethical reflection. And we entertain workshops building bridges between leaders of faiths and investment leaders on this important journey towards this impact investment. I will invite you to go these 3 steps. First, the SUG guidelines to faith-consistent investment, a conference 4 years ago. Then a white paper of the University of Zurich, together with the Center of Sustainable Finances and Wealth, just being published a few months ago. And then the conclusion, which I can give already here. This movement of the faith has a lot of potential, still rather limited in breadth and scope, but with a growing momentum. So first, take a look at those SUG guidelines. A conference which took place at our center 4 years ago, with about 50 representatives of different faiths being present, just to show you a few pictures. The background was that the Alliance of Religions and Conservation was asked by the UN 2015 to co-host a meeting on those forthcoming Sustainable Development Goals, and 24 faith groups had committed to action. And this rose the interest of the UNDP as well as the OECD, that actually the faiths could play an important role. And if they want the SDGs to be a success, maybe the faiths could help with this huge value shift. When you look at the background of faith-consistent investment, of course, the relationship between faith and finance is as old as the story of the faiths themselves. In the SUG guidelines, so this brochure having been published after this conference, underlines those 2 aspects: the wisdom of religions, also working out its values, and the business of religions. And the business, so here we have a lot of wealth, habitable land, commercial forests, schools, communication, mounting up to 10% roughly of the world's total financial investment. Before we enter more deeply into these criteria, of course, we have to take a critical look on the global financial system. And here the faiths are, I'd say, between prophetic criticism and pragmatic use. You remember this famous phrase of Pope Francis: can it be that it's not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it's a news item when the stock market loses 2 points? This against the background that, of course, also the churches remain heavily on a smooth and stable functioning of the global financial system. So this invitation to SUG, 31 faiths responded by written contributions, explaining their criteria for proactive investment, environmental and sustainable development. First, in those core values, you have the negative screening. That's what faiths are famous for. Usury, the ban of usury, important armament, alcohol, tobacco. More recently, taking stance against racism, the apartheid regime, and more recently now, carbon disinvestment movements. When we look at what the faiths are for, I'd like to show you of this collection a few qualitative quotes. Buddhist Hindu guidelines, which highlight this organic agriculture, food processing. The Christian guidelines, when we look at the Church of Sweden or the German Protestant Church, maybe the most systematic, speaking about principles of human dignity and intergenerational justice. The Jewish guidelines especially link the social and the environmental issue. And the Muslim guidelines, sure, we look at the small communities, but very interesting, I think, how they try to contribute here to the common good, looking at, well, Kenya or Nigeria. Already post-Zug, what was happening after this conference, the Edinburgh Declaration is important to be mentioned, which is a shared values framework published by the Islamic Finance Council, the Church of Scotland, and the Global Ethic Finance Initiative, which spell out 6 key shared values between Christian and Muslim traditions and deliver these values within their community, businesses, and responsible people of their communities. Post-Zug, also a series of conferences and Faith Invest, which has been founded as an international foundation, spells out its activities like faith long-term plans, faith consistent investment guidelines, and maybe most interesting recently, a Dharma index reaching out to the Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and Jain community. Now, when we look at the white paper of the University of Zurich and the Center for Sustainable Finances and Wealth, which of course, being a research paper, have done a more analytical approach. They focused on 14 interviewees of the Judeo-Christian tradition, be it from Europe, the US, or Australia. Again, they underline the important wealth of the faiths, but they also underline the personal and community transformative power, which can help to achieve this shift in impact investing. And they point out the trend of which I will speak later. What is typical in their view? It's again, the specific values of the faiths. It's their strong definition of the value set, negative screening, but also the positive impact investment, which then overlaps also with secular investors. A few characteristics of the faiths and their investment: low risk market rate return, dependency on external advisors and managers who maybe not primarily see the purpose of religious institutions and their impact investment, and yet a willingness to accept higher costs for faith alignment, especially monitoring the different initiatives, and a high desire, and this I think is important for the future, to collaborate with other communities or experts. So what are the challenges? They sum up the following: lack of strong leadership, maybe not only among the faiths, restricted to investing in market rate, yet there is a misperception that market rate would, that you couldn't combine market rate and impact investment. Lack of knowledge, experience, dependency on financial advisors and managers. But positive, once the faiths enter into this journey, they would usually go from exclusion to ESG integration, to impact on market rate level, and then also in this concessional dimension. And yet again, enablers of impact is that faiths usually have a long breath when speaking about and becoming active in impact investment. So conclusions, again, what is typical for faith impact investment? It's how to say, the structural set. So often ethic committees being active in these decision-making processes and maybe also slowing down certain decisions. Again, marrying impact and financial considerations, that's a strong point. Negative screening still has a very important aspect. The Chin's brief 2020 points out that of another survey where 33 faiths were interviewed, 88% were active in negative screening. So you can see how this plays, and only 11 in a more positive impact investing activity. Again, looking at personnel, sometimes the lack of information or of formation, and still the instrument market rate return, and yet there is learning going on that it can be combined with impact investing. So here's the conclusion. Yes, the momentum is building up. As one colleague of Faith Invest would say, faiths are not first movers. Maybe this was too idealistic at the beginning, but they are strong communities and they are second in following. And you have growing networks and initiatives looking at 3 impact investment conferences of the Vatican, or in Switzerland, the Swiss Impact Investment Association, which organized conferences with IRC or Faith Invest the last 4 years. Also the World Council of Churches in Geneva and their partners, having entertained conferences the past 4 years. You have growing networks among the different faiths. And now, as we celebrated the Laudato Si week, the economy of Francesco, those young economists, and the Vatican itself, which tries to spell out more initiatives in the economy. So just some pictures, also again, a more negative screening, that's information of Reuters of last year. This year, an info of towards the COP26, and again, the Laudato Si week this year, and here, the economy of Francesco. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for that overview of all the different initiatives that are happening in the area of faith-consistent investing. Working in this now every day, I can definitely confirm the level, the sense of momentum that's there in this movement of the faiths, in some ways led now by the Catholic Church in relation to Laudato Si and the operationalization of that, the implementation, but certainly other faith communities coming together, and a recognition of the challenges. You mentioned some of them around leadership, around, in a sense, being hung up on market rate, and the kind of externalization of a lot of the knowledge base is a major issue for faiths, kind of having outsourced a lot of their brains on the how do you manage money, and the need to build those bridges. But essentially what you outlined very much is quite a pragmatic approach to this, in a sense that we're not done with talking. Talking will always be important and bringing richness of ideas, but there's an impatience. And maybe I'll put that to you first, take the chair's prerogative as we wait on questions coming in. Do you sense impatience in this movement to actually do things, to move from ideas into action?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, as you have seen, I think it's, how to say, more important is that there are good, how to say, examples. Like when you look at the Church of Sweden, or the Church of England, right? So I think this impresses more, how to say, the stakeholders than some kind of a moral, how to say, advice that you can say and show it's possible, you know, and you can encourage also smaller institutions of church or state to follow kind of a sophisticated commitment to more productive impact investment.
And I think that power of example speaks very much to what you were saying, Michael, as well. This need, like, in a sense, you were talking about the democratization or the decentralization. Can you think of examples of where this transition, this value shift is happening already?
Well, I mentioned Sparkasse in Germany. Germany has the most diversified banking sector in Europe. The difficulty is that the European Union's central bank's rules are increasingly threatening the survival of local Sparkasse. I mean, I worked in Heidelberg in 2018 for a whole year and had an account there. But increasingly, these banks are being put under huge pressure. And of course, at the same time, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve have all trailed their intention to start to issue central bank digital money. Now, whether it be one currency or three, that's still an open question. Of course, there are some people looking at the Great Reset who think that ultimately it's going to be one global currency, which will represent a huge amount of control going to a very small number of people. So it will not open up, but rather close down the democracy of money. And the further troubling feature of this shift to central bank digital currencies is it will put ordinary banks out of business. I mean, if the Sparkasse cannot lend money, which is the process by which they create money, and they're in competition with the central bank, they'll close. Professor Richard Werner at the University of Leicester has been trying to start a community bank in Winchester for more than 5 years, and he's been given the runaround over and over again by the Bank of England, who basically don't want him to start a community bank, because if he succeeded in this, it would show that the centralized money creation project, which in Britain is in the hands of only basically 3 large banks, is problematic. And just in case anybody thinks this is just some weird conspiracy theory, Richard Werner has actually published empirical papers showing how banks create money from nothing when they lend money. And furthermore, Mervyn King, very soon after he resigned from the Bank of England, having never seen the worst crash in London's history since, well, certainly since 1929, basically confessed, or fessed up, as we say in Scotland, to the reality of money creation. It's actually in his book. I've got the titles in my head, but not at the tip of my tongue. But Mervyn King, look it up. It's there in the book. And he says, yeah, we kind of let it run wild and we didn't really think it was a problem. And oh, yeah, look at 2008. Oh, yeah, a bit of a problem. And then it started all over again. They didn't stop the derivatives trading and the speculative investment, which money creation is fueling. There is now over a quadrillion of derivatives in the combined capitals of Frankfurt, London, and New York, according to the International Bank of Settlements based in Geneva. The report they issued in May 2020 said that the world was on the brink of an even bigger financial crash in December 2019, because the quantity of derivatives now is $1.25 quadrillion. And that problem has not been resolved by helicopter money. They've simply poured money into all of the 3 major cities in order to keep the investors happy. And that, of course, has led to further centralization of money and power. At the same time, COVID regulations have closed millions of businesses, many of them for good. You walk around any street of any capital city in the world at the moment, and all the small businesses are gone. What are left are chains. And of course, online digital companies like Amazon and Google and so on, who've hoovered up vast amounts of power and wealth from the COVID-19 pandemic. So, yeah, I wished I could be more positive in my reply. I know there are viable alternatives, and Tobias indeed has also been talking about these. But when it comes to money creation, the world at the moment seems to me to be going in a problematic direction. But let me end with one more example. I also have happen to have become rather more familiar than perhaps a professor of ethics should be with something called the crypto market in the last 6 months. I've had a bit of an education in this by a very delightful English businessman here in Indonesia. And one of the coins that I've invested in is Cardano. Now, Cardano is an altcoin. It's the only altcoin that outperformed the recent bear market in the crypto world and didn't decline at all in the last 4 months. But it's still it's a very cheap investment. But the point about Cardano is that its inventor, Charles Hoskinson, who also helped to create Ethereum, argues that it will become the financial backbone of Africa. And he is a progressive, and he genuinely believes in financial democratization and using blockchain as the vehicle. Now, there are critics who say, but this will just mean that all African transactions are surveyed and potentially then controlled by African central banks, as will a cashless economy in, say, the UK. But I don't want to be so cynical. I think that the Cardano project is one of the projects in the crypto world which actually has social and ecological potential. And I think it's worth watching.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I mean, I think it's really kind of interesting, the contrasting approaches that I guess the faiths coming at this through their investments, and then I guess the scale of the challenge of, in a sense, dethroning what has emerged, the sheer scale of the financial system and those derivatives that you described, how all pervasive that has become. We have lots of questions come in now, and I'd like to pause on this, the first one here around donut economics by Kate Raworth. This idea of donut economics, which has got various forms, but really Kate Raworth is the one who's kind of carried it forward, of concentric circles, of reframing the model of economics within the planetary systems and looking at the social floor of humanity. The question from Rosie Burrows is, donut economics by Kate Raworth seems to like a solid framework, a necessary shift alongside other trauma healing, psychological, cultural and political shifts. What do the panels say to this? Maybe Father Tobias, would you like to take that first? Are you familiar with Kate Raworth's model of donut economics?
I'm not an economist, so I can speak on very practical.
Yeah.
So I leave it to Michael, please.
Leave it to Michael. Michael, what's your perspective on this new model of economics?
I mean, I've read the donut a book. I read it in 2018. Oddly enough, when I was in Heidelberg, I was teaching a course there in economics and theology, and I've been studying economics as an amateur since I did it at A level. Indeed, I was supposed to study it at university, and my father was extremely disappointed when he discovered that I'd applied to do theology instead, because he was going to have to pay the bills in those days. But anyway, I don't regret my choice. Part of the reason for my choice is even when I was at school, I thought that economics was based on models, not on reality.
Yeah.
And what Kate Raworth has tried to do in that book, whether or not it's successful, I think it's partially successful, is to try to bring the models literally down to earth, but also into interaction with human society. And I think there are a number of good proposals in the book, but I still, like most economists, she has no theory of money. And I mean, right back in 2007, when I wrote my book on moral climate, the ethics of global warming, I argued in that book that I'd found evidence online, actually, from the Federal Reserve of a direct correlation between rising greenhouse gas emissions and rising money creation since 1971, when the gold standard was ended by Richard Nixon. I mean, no one really picked up on it, but I still think that was a really crucial finding. But it was a long and dense book, but I think it was a crucial finding. Now, of course, people would say, correlation doesn't equal causation. However, given the power of money, once you've created money, it looks for things to do. It looks for return, ROI, return on investment. So if you create huge amounts of money, you're pushing Just like an air pump, you're just pushing the air, but air pump's the wrong model. It will go to a vacuum. So it will find a place on the earth which is least regulated and least overseen by governments. And it will go in there, it'll chop down the trees, it'll dam the rivers, it'll mine the soils, and it'll wreck the environment. That's what money does. And so that's why I call it Luciferan, that it's a dark magic. And I'm afraid that I don't think Kate Raworth's book really deals with the dark monetary manipulation. And I think unless you do that, you're leaving out the biggest problem of all. And it's, again, I underline, it is a false god. And I increasingly see it as Lucifer. And I don't want to come across as a sort of Manichaean, extreme dualist. But it's very interesting that in both the New Testaments, if there's one source of evil, it is described as money. First in the revelation of the Ten Commandments, and then in the teachings of Jesus. Money is the root of all evil, remember, in the gospel.
So we have a situation then today, just where faith communities, as Tobias outlined for us, have vast assets invested in investments, all different kinds of assets, but financial assets in particular. How well do you think, Tobias, that faith communities have addressed this? Because this teaching on money is not new. This is very much crosses many different faith traditions, especially the Judeo-Christian traditions. How well do these guidelines that have been produced address this kind of core teaching on money? And is there not a paradox there between what Michael's saying and the kind of faith invest type of approach to addressing investments?
Well, I don't know, Michael, if we take the parable of our Lord on the talents, right? And those are the three people presenting, what should I do, Lord? And then they invest in different things, right? And the last phrase is, if you only had put your money on a bank. So, of course, the Bible is not an economic book, but still, sure, you have here the biblical tradition, which already fights, how to contribute with the wealth of religions and that kind of opening up your talents or your wealth to a community can be more fruitful than keeping it to yourself, right? Yeah. So I mean, this is a 2,000 years story, right? And so this is in the mind of the faiths. How can we make our wealth be operable for the common good?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. However, the very significant change took place in the history of Christianity, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In the New Testament, the ban on usury was continued. Jesus never lifted it. The ban on usury, as you well know, came from the Old Testament. It's in the Jewish tradition. What this led to in practice, though, however, was that Jews became the bankers of Europe because they were the only ones in Christendom who could lend money at interest, because they were allowed to lend money at interest to foreigners, but not to each other by the Old Testament law. Whereas the New Testament, they turned the law into a universal law. So they said Christians couldn't lend money at interest to each other or to anybody else. This had extremely unfortunate consequences. However, of course, in the Middle Ages, what happened was that the Roman Catholic Church got tired of these economic restrictions and then increasingly created instruments. And there's a huge and fascinating literature, which I won't bore you with, on medieval economics, which I happen to have read, which explains how particularly the building of St. Peter's destroyed. And of course, we all know the history of the, indulgences and so on. Although indulgences actually have not been banned. I mean, it's actually in the catechism, believe it or not. The new catechism still refers to indulgences, which I find incredible. But the point is, it was the indulgences which led to the Reformation. And of course, indulgences were a form of lending money at interest, and it was heavenly interest. But Rome also created many other devices to allow simony, which was supposed to be a mortal sin. What happened at the Reformation, of course, which was a reaction to what Rome was doing economically, was that John Calvin comes along and says, well, we carry on as we were before. And he was, I think, on economics, the most influential reformer. He was a total polymath, absolutely extraordinary how much he knew about everything. But he was the pastor of a congregation of bankers in Geneva. Now, Geneva, not London, I didn't have time to talk about Geneva as well, but it was really the other place other than London where central banking and subscription banks, above all, were created. So, you give your gold to a merchant and then he issues paper. I mean, that was the basis of subscription banks. But then they went one stage further and a group of people will get together and then create these subscription banks, which was money creation. And although Calvin continued to oppose lending money at interest, in the end, he had to give up on the idea that it was a mortal sin. And I do think that was a really seminal moment, because instead of Christians recovering the early Christian idea that, as you just said rightly, money is a good that has good potential when it's kind of subjected to the community, However, if money is freed from the community, it becomes a power over the community. And this, I'm afraid, is ultimately what happened in the Reformation. It's a way more complex story than the one Max Weber tells in the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, because, of course, Max Weber also has no theory of money. Well, as you can tell, I could talk for a long time about all this, and it's very fascinating. It's a fascinating topic, but it is also a very serious issue, because we are living at the moment through the greatest period of money creation in human history. And the ecological consequences of that are just not being addressed. I mean, I see stuff online about climate credits, for example. I mean, it doesn't even scratch the surface. And actually, climate credits underwrite the whole problem, because what are climate credits? I tweeted half an hour ago on this, actually. Climate credits are just another form of derivative. It's astonishing. They're paper. It's like indulgences. I've actually compared them to indulgences in a book. I'm not the first philosopher to do that. They're paper devices to make people feel better about driving down the road in a fossil fuel vehicle or taking that flight to Barcelona if the government and its public health regulations will allow them. So I'm afraid that faith communities also have got dragged into this carbon credit, climate credit, green investment kind of game. And they have neglected the underlying spiritual issue, which is the dark, sorry to repeat it, but it is the dark Luciferan magic of money creation.
Thanks. And how, coming back to you, Tobias, then, how do this kind of faith investment in movement that's emerging address some of those deeper issues? Is there a space within there to look at the creation of money, to look at the whole question, for example, of usury, of some of these deeper, more, let's say, more fundamental issues that Michael's talking about, or is it much more about how faith can invest a bit more, in the markets and invest a little bit better?
I remember the conference, right, 4 years ago, where they had very practical projects. For example, the project Sacred Cities, So to go on a pilgrimage is not only a topic within the Christian traditions, also in the Muslim or other traditions. So, but how do you care for the environment when thousands of people come with their plastic bottles and so forth? So very practical, right? So how, on the one hand, can you help people with their spiritual thirst, and yet accompany them in a respected environmental responsibility, and to do this very practically, and to do this with assets of the faiths, So very practical, down to earth. So projects were presented and kind of answers were given, and people found then financial support for putting into practice what was debated and what was just a real need. Or I remember, the Cardinal Turkson from the Vatican, who was before Cardinal in Africa, who would say, well, what we need are these investment projects. Those times are past where we collect money in Europe for little projects someplace, but it has to be much a more long-term strategy with the different stakeholders around the table. So this is what I remember from those discussions. And this is the very practical debate we had and practical solutions we found. And of course, we need this theoretical debate on the philosophy of money. But this is not my topic.
Thank you. There's questions here now, and I want to get to some of the questions. So there's one here from Cecilia Lorio. It's for you, Michael, but I might ask both of you because it's very interesting. What a transition? Can you tell us what a transition from what it is to a new economic? If that's sorry, the question is. What would the transition from where we are now to a new economic, if that's the way we call it, look like? So if I could just ask, maybe Michael, you go first, and then to Tobias.
Well, essentially, as you gathered, Lorna, I am calling for the democratization of money. However, unfortunately, at the moment, COVID-19 is taking the world in the opposite direction. So we've had huge numbers of small business closures and cultural venue closures, which has, if anything, reduced the democratization of money even further than it was before. And even more so in the developing world. I'm living in the developing world. And here, basically, COVID has just caused hunger. They don't have social security and all that kind of thing in the developing world. If you lock people down in the third world, they go hungry, and the deaths from that will be higher than COVID-19. And the United Nations even now is saying that. But I mean, I said it right at the beginning to a manager of the WHO. I've never understood why these universal policies were adopted. So they've actually resulted in more centralization of power and money. So obviously, I think that we should be going in the opposite direction. But as I say, realistically, I don't think we're going to. I think the direction we're going is digital currencies. The question is how that's going to play out. Are the three largest central banks simply going to copy China, because China's already rolling out digital yuan, right? Are they going to copy China, or are they going to do something more democratic and less totalitarian? And that remains an open question. But I think that until democracies recover some sort of political and ethical control over money creation, the continued growth and inequality globally, which is a major driver, by the way, of ecological problems, because most of the, take climate, most emissions come from a relatively small number of people, 5–10%, and organizations. The vast majority of people on the planet do not make a big impact on the climate whatsoever. But I do think that in the digital currency space, there are alternative models, which is what I was trying to say about Cardano. And I may be wrong about Cardano, but to me, it looks like, and it's very interesting that it's backed by so many universities, including, I discovered, my former University of Edinburgh Blockchain Research Institute. And I do feel that people involved in that project they're idealists. They're practical, because it's an attempt to replace the current forms of value exchange via central bank money creation, which is basically debt-based money. And perhaps I haven't fully explained that to people. But when you create, money is created by private banks by debt creation. So you take out a mortgage, say, and then they put 100,000 in your bank account that didn't exist before. And then you pay it back and they get another 100,000. And then you also pay interest and they probably get another 80,000. So at the end, they've created 3 times the amount of money from nothing that they started with. Yeah. This is called fractional reserve banking, but it's a highly problematic model. And that's what's driving, say, for example, real estate, investment, and so on and so forth. So I think it's, of all the possibilities, the most realistic model I can see is responsible, distributed, blockchain, money exchange and creation. Because the key, I'm not so much talking about Bitcoin, but some of the better alternative cryptocurrencies, and particularly the Cardano project, the key to them is this is distributed money creation, and it's secure. And that's what's missing in the current system, is a properly distributed system of money creation and a value exchange. So I'm not completely giving up hope on humanity. I don't think Charles Hoskinson is a Christian. I think he's just a kind of classic left liberal progressive. But I think it's an admirable project, and I do commend people to look at it later. I think of all the projects I've seen for the African continent, Cardano does have huge potential. I mean, of course, the other big one is the Chinese takeover of much of Africa using investment aid, which turns into debt and then forces African governments to do what China says, which is the totalitarian alternative. We basically have these two approaches. We have democratic and distributed money creation, or we have the Chinese model, which looks like being copied by the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve, i.e. basically communism. The government knows when you spend every cent in China, right? And if we do the same in London, New York, and Frankfurt, the government knows when you gave £10 to, I don't know, Jeremy Corbyn, the government will know. And if they don't like Jeremy Corbyn, they will say, oh, we don't like Michael Northcott either because he supported him. Well, I didn't actually support Jeremy Corbyn, but you see the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Tobias, do you want to come in here on the transition? Where do you see from where you're sitting? Well,
very practical. I'm not entering theories of money. When you look at investment of those assets of the faiths, right? Do they just, as I mentioned, wait for market rate return, or as, for example, I quote one pension fund, do you offer them the possibility to invest in mental health or in forestation, food waste, And do you offer them, those faiths are also careful, well, we need a certain return to finance our activities, and yet we can invest 10%, 15% on these important issues which are important to our values, and we can monitor that. Does really the money arrive there, and are these projects really doing something, right? Mm-hmm. So this is an example of a pension fund, another example of an endowment. Here they discussed with the board to invest into health, in education, energy efficiency, renewable energy, right? So you have to understand those are rather conservative boards sometimes, and it's already a big step forward, right? When you can kind of invite them that it's not just a certain market rate return, but it can be useful in a Christian way, investing into interesting projects, and they can monitor it. They are not just doing something and it's ending up in a black box, just as a very concrete example.
Thank you. So I'm going to come to a different question here. Again, we're kind of going down the same direction, but Widia is asking, again, I'll put it to both of you, maybe starting with you, Tobias, around any practical ideas on how to dethrone those in power. They're hiding behind so many layers. So how do we shift from where we are, the current status quo? If you want to give your perspective on that.
Well, I'm living in Switzerland. So it's a rather, you have to enter into a debate of a community. You have to convince. The interesting thing of Switzerland is very decentralized, right? And you won't move things if you say you are the devil and I'm the redeemer, right? But you have to bring in the topics within, those famous elections. You have to convince the different stakeholders, right? So you have to put forward now, where is the win-win situation actually for all the different stakeholders involved, and then we can move the next step. So I think this is at the same, again, now looking at Laudato Si and Francis, also looking at the Amazon Synod, he would always underline, if something is going to a big conflict, that's not the spirit behind, we have to, when we do a discernment of spirit, then a majority has to kind of carry on, especially if it's a church institution. It doesn't help us when we split up and then we lose our influence and lose our power. So again, finding a common position and having patience and winning the other and listening to the other is so important also in this field of finding a solution in these environmental issues.
Thank you. And Michael?
I'm reflecting a bit on the question of the extent to which faith communities have provided a genuine alternative or not. I mean, if I look at the church commissioners, I'm sorry, but I don't really see a really significant leadership there. Or even the Church of Scotland, you're speaking from Scotland, right? or at least you speak with a very wonderful Scottish accent. So I haven't seen huge leadership. If you look at the Vatican Bank, we all know, well, I'm sure many of you know, the terrible things that have gone on there. Money laundering and goodness knows what. So I feel that the faith communities need to recover the ban on simony. They need to start speaking out more loudly about the creation of money as debt. It is a debt that is visited on people and on nations, but it is also visited on the planet. And I mean, I wrote about this in my book on moral climate, the ethics of global warming, that the extent of debt, money creation as debt, was a debt, it's ecological debt, that the planet cannot pay, it's unpayable. And so I would end really with a call for Christians to pray and to become more aware of money as a spiritual as well as an economic reality. And you know, that to me is really urgent. And I also would call on Christians to start to ask their leaders, particularly when they have pension funds, to be more innovative in seeking ways to democratize investment at the same time as seeking ways to reduce the tendency of investment to seek a return on investment, regardless of the effects on people and the planet. I mean, there's, to me, absolute priorities. Reviving the ban on simony, stopping the endless creation of debt-based money. And I mean, there are other ways of doing this. You could talk about credit unions, for example, as well as savings banks, starting small community enterprises. There, among the more hopeful projects to me in the UK, for example, is the Bristol Pound, which is only spendable with a 50-mile radius of the centre of Bristol. And that to me is a really powerful example. And HMRC actually recognised the Bristol Pound. And so, because that's what that's doing is it's resituating money in place. So I think, you know, I've done a bit of research on the Bristol Pound initiative. I think it's a remarkable community initiative and did get buy-in from ultimately from HMRC, and the Bank of England did not oppose it. So perhaps just leave my comment there with a hopeful story. And I happen to know a lot of people of faith were involved in the creation of the Bristol Pound project. It's a very impressive project.
I think that is a very hopeful note for us to finish our session on. It's been absolutely fascinating and very thought-provoking talking to both of you and hearing these quite diverse perspectives and approaches to what is one of the most important topics of our time, how we reframe, how we reshape money and the economy to address the crises, the ecological crises that we're facing today. I'll now hand over to Severine, or is it Rebecca, to the Laudato Si Institute to give you some housekeeping before you move on to the next session.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you, and thank you everyone for participating in these very stimulating sessions today. Shortly, and in just over 45 minutes, Professor Linda Hogan of Trinity College Dublin will be delivering a public lecture on human rights and the vulnerabilities of gender in a climate emergency. Please note that there is a separate Zoom link for this lecture because it is a public lecture and is being made available to a wider audience than the participants of this conference. So thank you, and we look forward to welcoming you back shortly.